Howdy y'all, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for being here. Today we're going to get right back into the Old World series of videos. And if you're new here, this is a series of videos where we look at the oldest and most important cities from around the world from pre-1900. And we try to locate the oldest known photographs of these cities, and I'll showcase those while discussing what the current narrative has to say about the history of this area. And today we'll be looking at the capital of Ohio, which is Columbus. And what led me to this direction of research is recently I made a video on Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And if you haven't checked that out already, I would recommend checking that out. But I found a lot of similarities between Pittsburgh and ancient or old world Columbus, even down to the Native Americans that occupied these lands. When I make these videos, I always like to start in the beginning where the narrative begins, or in the oldest history of these areas that I could find. So when we discuss most of these cities in the United States, we want to talk about the native occupation of that land. And when we talk about Columbus, we have the date of 1000 BC that is given. So from this date until roughly the early 1700s, in the narrative, it says that Columbus was occupied by the ancient mound builders. And these are very important Native Americans to the area because of the way that they constructed the land and all of the ancient monuments and homes and different things that we really don't even know what purpose they served. So it's interesting to note the ancient mound builders not only occupied Pittsburgh that I mentioned in a previous video, but they also occupied the nearby city of Columbus. And in Columbus and the surrounding area, they left behind very beautiful and massive ancient mounds and monuments. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit right now. The ancient mound builders consisted of three main groups of Native Americans, and these were the Adena, the Hopewell, and the Fort Ancient. And these are very important names. You'll see them come up repeatedly when you look into the oldest history of many of these old world cities. And one of the most important, I believe, of this group is the Fort Ancient group. Obviously, these groups did not name themselves, and there is a reason that we refer to this specific group of Native Americans as Fort Ancient. So I'm going to look into that further in a later video, but I just wanted to point that out right now. Now, according to this narrative about Columbus, they say the only remaining physical evidence of the mound builders are the burial mounds, and many of the mounds that still exist today are outside of the city limits of Columbus. However, one mound, the Shrum Mound, is upkept and is now part of a historical site within Columbus. What I found really interesting is this part of the narrative where they say Mound Street, which is a popular street in Columbus and has had the name Mound Street for centuries, comes from a massive mound that occupied both Mound and High Streets at one point. Now, this mound had the clay and brick taken from it, and it was torn down. And this clay and brick that was supplied by this ancient mound was used to create most of the city's initial buildings in Columbus. So let me repeat that. They took an ancient burial mound from the Native Americans, and they took the bricks from that mound and they used that to build the first rendition of the city of Columbus. And they say this includes the Ohio State House, which we'll look at later in the video. But you can see all the massive buildings that they were building using these bricks from this ancient mound. So we can only imagine just how massive the original mound that stood on both Mound and High Streets really was. So let's get back to what the current narrative has to say about Columbus, Ohio. Originally, modern-day Columbus was part of the Ohio country under control of the French Empire through the Viceroyalty of New France from 1663 until 1763. And during this time period, fur trade in the area really flourished. This attracted many European settlers. However, when they would arrive to the area, they were often caught between the many warring factions. In the 1740s, Pennsylvania traders overran the area of Columbus until the French sent reinforcements and expelled them. The territory was continually plagued by conflict during the French and Indian and 7 Years' Wars. However, in 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and this finally ceded the land of Columbus to the British and allowed for European settlers to fully develop this area. After the U.S. Revolution, the Virginia Military District became part of the Ohio Country as a territory owned by Virginia. However, when East Coast colonists moved into Columbus, they encountered Miami, Delaware, Wyandot, Shawnee, and Mingo native nations already occupying the land of Columbus. The tribes resisted U.S. control, which led to many bloody conflicts, culminating in the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, which officially opened the land of Columbus for new settlers. In 1797, Lucas Sullivan, a surveyor from Virginia, founded a permanent settlement which he named Franklinton. A flood, however, wiped out Franklinton less than 1 year later in 1798. However, Sullivan persisted, and he moved his settlement slightly inland in what is now present-day Columbus. Around the same time, the United States set aside roughly 103,000 acres, including Columbus, to be part of the Refugee Tract, a large area of land to be occupied by Canadians sympathetic to the United States cause in the Revolution and affected by British rule in Canada. Upon its inception, 67 Canadian families moved in. So around this time period, we can already start to see the melting pot of Columbus, Ohio, really starting to take shape. However, even at this point, Ohio is not even a state yet. So let's get into what the current narrative has to say about the history of Columbus during the 1800s. Now, Ohio achieved statehood in 1803. However, there could be no agreement on the capital. The capital went back and forth between two different towns before Ohio delegates decided to choose a brand new location to be the official capital of Ohio. Franklinton donated two 10-acre plots, which would later become the Ohio State House and the Ohio Penitentiary, respectively. Named in honor of Columbus, the city was officially founded on February 14th, 1812, and it was located just outside of Franklinton. The city officially became the capital of Ohio in 1816, and Jarvis Pike was the first mayor. Now, the War of 1812 brought prosperity to the area of Columbus, but without direct river or trail connections, Columbus's initial growth was very slow. However, by 1831, the National Road and the Ohio and Erie Canal both reached Columbus, creating a population boom. At this time, the narrative says, many German immigrants arrived to the area, and these German immigrants are credited with creating and constructing many of the old world buildings that we'll look at in this video, including the Trinity Seminary and the Capitol University. Now, some buildings that opened up around this time period were the Ohio State School for the Blind, which was a massive building that opened in 1837. You also have the Ohio School for the Deaf, another massive school building that opened in 1832. You have the Ohio Penitentiary, which opened officially in 1834, and by 1834, Columbus was officially chartered as a city of Ohio with a population of 3,500. John Brooks was the first popularly elected mayor of Columbus, and by 1837, Columbus had annexed most of the city of Franklinton. In 1851, the first railway arrived to Columbus, And by 1875, 8 different railroads served Columbus. In 1857, the Ohio State House opened after 18 years of construction, using the bricks that I mentioned earlier from the ancient native mound. Now, some other interesting buildings of note that I want to talk about were the 1849 Green Lawn Cemetery, which they say was opened in Columbus after a disease outbreak in the 1840s. And we also have a set population in 1850 of roughly 18,000 people. So you can see just how quickly this city is growing at the time period. So in the next few minutes, we're going to talk a little bit more about the history of Columbus in the 1800s, but I want to start diving into this collection of old world photographs, or the oldest photographs of Columbus that I could find, because there are a lot of buildings here that I want to take a look at, and many of them are massive and really intricate in the design, and the architecture really leads to a time-consuming process, yet we're told that these buildings were popping up in Columbus all throughout the 1800s. So let's just take a look at them and let me know your thoughts down below. So I think one of the most important factors to point out when we look at these massive building projects in Columbus, Ohio, is to note all the different groups of people that had influence on the building of these projects. Now, Columbus is noted as having a large African American community in the 1800s, and this community was active in the Underground Railroad, led by James Preston Poindexter from the 1840s, and he served the community until the early 1900s as a Baptist leader and a focal point of the African American community in Columbus. Now, around this same time, in 1862, Ohio signed a charter for a university to be created in Columbus, and this would go on to become Ohio State University, founded in 1870. From the 1870s onward, Columbus became a key city for manufacturing in the United States and became known as the buggy capital of the world for its over 24 unique buggy factories that once stood on the land of Columbus. The steel industry also thrived around this time, led by Samuel Bush, and it also became a place that strived for better working conditions for its workers under the leadership of Samuel Gompers. Now, in 1880, the population of Columbus was 52,000 people, roughly. In 1899, it's written that the Masonic Meeting Hall was finished in Columbus, and around this time in the year 1900, the population of Columbus had shot up the whole way to 125,000 people. Now, by the 1900s, it's written, Columbus continued to reach a pretty rapid set of growth. It was known as the City of Arches due to almost 100 wooden arches that spanned over High Street and the surrounding area in Columbus. These arches were illuminated, and they basically lit up the city at night, and they later went on to be used by the overhead trolley system that would appear in Columbus. These arches, however, were torn down by the year 1912, and they were replaced with more common lights. So for the next part of the video, we're just going to continue to look at these awesome buildings that were built in the 1800s and built by these different groups of people that all had an influence on what was going on. You can see there is influence from the steel industry, and you can see that there's influence from other parts of the town, and it really creates this melting pot that has all these unique buildings and these massive buildings everywhere. So let's look at those today, and let's see if we can find anything that really stands out about these images. And we'll get back into the current narrative about what happened in the 1900s and later in Columbus in just a little bit. But for now, let's look at these images and see if there's anything awesome that stands out to us. Now, the next major event that this narrative talks about in the history of Columbus is the Great Flood of 1913, and this occurred on March 25th of that year. During this flood, over 90 perished and over 1,000 homes were destroyed in the city of Columbus. Now, to prevent future floods, the Army Corps of Engineers built a retaining wall around large portions of Columbus. They also widened the river and constructed new bridges throughout the city. After World War I, a construction and population boom again hit the city of Columbus, and during this time period is when many of the old world buildings, the buildings that are masonry and brick, were either demolished or repurposed and replaced with steel buildings. And this trend continued through the 1930s and the 1940s. The Great Depression, which affected large parts of the population of America, according to this narrative, really missed when it comes to Columbus, and there wasn't many parts of Columbus that were affected by this Great Depression. With the onset of World War II, another boom occurred, and again we have even more new steel buildings being built all throughout Columbus, and they're basically replacing the old world buildings that once stood there. So while we look at Columbus today, we can notice a handful of these buildings that remain from the 1800s. Many of the oldest and most unique buildings that we've looked at in this video have been replaced throughout time by more modern steel buildings. Now we're just going to get into a couple of fun facts from the 1900s and onwards about Columbus, Ohio, while we go over the rest of these remaining photographs that I could find. While I'm going to be giving you facts from the 1900s about Columbus, these photographs are going to be the rest of the collection of the oldest photographs I could find from the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And there's a couple photographs sprinkled in here from the early 1900s as well. So for the rest of the video, I'm just going to show you these remaining old world photographs that I found of Columbus that I wanted to share with you. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments about these buildings, this architecture, this city, and the layout down below. But diving back into the narrative and some facts about Columbus from the 1900s, we have a population of nearly 237,000 in the year 1920. And in 1922, the Ohio State University completes the Ohio Stadium. In 1927, the world's fifth largest building at the time, the American Insurance Union Citadel, is completed in Columbus, Ohio. So, in conclusion, I hope that these images were as revealing for you as they were for me. They definitely point to the importance of Columbus as an old world city, and they definitely lend to the narrative that there was a lot going on in Columbus even before European settlers arrived. We have these large and massive ancient mounds that are said to not only be earthworks or built with earth, but also built with clay and brick that would then go on to shape the city of Columbus. And throughout the 1800s and even into the 1900s, at time periods when America was struggling, Columbus was thriving. And it really seems like Columbus developed independently from the rest of Ohio. It really has its own unique history with these unique stories and narratives to tell. So I thought I would share these oldest images with you, and hopefully there was something in this video that either entertained you or stood out to you. And let me know what you think about the video, about Columbus, about the architecture, and about the ancient mounds down in the comments below, and we will discuss it amongst ourselves. Maybe we can figure something out about this beautiful land that we might not have discussed in the video. So again, I thank you very much for being here. I look forward to hearing your comments down below, and we will talk again on the very next video.